a number of examples of how Ireland is complicit. One of them is the transfer of military support and weapons at the time when a genocide is happening. So how do you square this? How do you intervene, perhaps positively, in the case of the ICJ, South Africa's case at the ICJ, and at the same time there are US shipments, planes that are coming through Ireland, that are using Irish territory, that may have weapons on them, they may have other forms of military support in them, at a time that a genocide is happening.
If I could just start with maybe to set the tone with a quotation, you've probably already heard it. It's from Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur, and she said, "There's this tendency to be very supportive with rhetoric, as Ireland has, but when it comes to taking concrete actions, there is zero. Not a little, zero. The countries that have been most outspoken, like Ireland, what have they done in practice? Nothing. And this is shameful, this is disgraceful."
Relates to Francesca Albanese's quote, is in Ireland, there's still diplomatic, military, academic, cultural relations with Israel. There's still trade with Israel. Ireland is one of Israel's biggest trade partners.
Welcome, and really delighted that you're here and delighted to listen to you.
Hi everyone. Thanks very much for having me. It's really an honor to be in Cork. Thanks to all of you for coming to the Cork Palestine Solidarity Campaign, the Irish Palestine Solidarity Campaign for organizing everything. And it's quite special. I mean, for me, I've been to Ireland before. In 2017, I came for a short period of time. But this time I've been going around. I went to Belfast, all the way from Belfast to Cork, and it's really special for a Palestinian to be in Ireland. And it's also very special to be speaking to you on the anniversary of Land Day, as Martin just explained. And I'll be touching on some of the things that came in the introduction. As you know, as we're here today, we're gathered here today as I speak, Israel continues its live-streamed genocide against our families, friends, colleagues, people in Gaza, 2.3 million people in the besieged and occupied Gaza Strip. And it's very important to understand the genocide, to be able to confront it. And to understand the genocide, the understanding can come at two levels. One, if I might call it kind of a macro level, is putting the genocide in the context of settler colonialism and apartheid. We Palestinians are up against settler colonial endeavor project, a European settler colonial project now for over 100 years. At the heart of this project is Zionist ideology. It's a racist ideology that seeks a supremacy of one group over others. And in 1948, this project attempted genocide. As all settler colonial projects, settler colonialists see the land without the people. It's empty of the indigenous. And those who are on it are not humans. They're savages, they're terrorists, they're always a threat. They're always something that must be removed. So genocide is inherent. It's at the heart of settler colonialism. In North America, and of course genocide took different forms against the native populations there. One form was taking the children of the indigenous from their families and putting them in boarding schools. And those boarding schools were projects that were joint between the church and the military. And the slogan for these boarding schools was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." And why I'm mentioning this is because it reflects what I'm trying to say about how settler colonialists see the indigenous, is that they are a threat to humanity as conceived by Europeans, right? So here the indigenous, the native, is a threat to the entirety of that project. It touches the heart of it. And so is true, for Zionist settler colonialism. And so in 1948, there was an attempt at genocide. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forcibly kicked out of their homes. Thousands were massacred. But the genocide was not complete. There were thousands of Palestinians who remained on their lands. Some were moved from their lands. And so when genocide cannot be completed, the second best option would be apartheid. And the apartheid that was established in 1948 in the form of the State of Israel is as following. It's a regime that rests on 4 pillars. The first pillar is the fragmentation of the indigenous population. It's splitting them into parts, divide and conquer type of logic, right? And the ultimate example of this is the forcible displacement of the majority of Palestinians in what then became Israel, and not allowing these Palestinians to come back. So this, very significant fragmentation of the population. Those who are outside become refugees in refugee camps in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and so on, and those who remained inside. And those then who remained inside, coming to the second pillar of the apartheid regime, is you segregate. Now you have a colonial society. You segregate the indigenous away, you separate them from the colonial society, and you impose a system of violent control against them. And this took the form of military rule. Palestinians in what we call now 1948, what became Israel, was immediately in 1948 put under military rule. They were restricted to their areas of living. The Palestinian Bedouins in the south were actually moved from their places of living and work and put in an area that was surrounded by fence in the Naqab Negev desert. So fragmentation, segregation, and violent control. And the third pillar is dispossession, is the taking away of property, of homes, of anything that would allow you to be empowered and to live and to sustain yourself, right? The essentials here are land and home. And the fourth pillar is the deprivation, is always ensuring that the indigenous society is at a disadvantage economically and socially when compared with the colonial society. Now, to maintain this regime of oppression and domination, there are crimes, systematic crimes, that are perpetrated to maintain it. And here in Palestine, the crimes are also 4. One, it's the forcible displacement, it's the systematic demolition of homes because homes do not have a building permit, or because somebody who lives in that home has carried an attack against an army or so on. It's a punitive home demolition. It also takes the form of revoking your legal status, so you no longer have the right to live in your home, in your community, or in your village. And of course, that legal status is given by the colonial regime itself. So it takes very forms, the forcible displacement, always trying to push the indigenous people outside of their homes and towns and villages and so on. The second inhumane act, which is basically a grave human rights violation, is the systematic killing. Is that you use lethal force as a colonial regime. You use lethal force in meeting demonstrations, in the administration of, for example, in raids to carry out arrests, in the military checkpoints to control and so on. So the immediate reaction is to kill. So kill as many as possible in a systematic way. You don't need justification. There's no need to have the legal backing for it. The third one is systematic arbitrary detention and torture. It's the detention of Palestinians, again, without needing any legal reasoning to do that, and without needing to charge or try. Sorry. It's okay. This is this is called administrative detention in Palestine. It was actually a British practice that was inherited by then the Israeli apartheid regime. And it means the detention without charge or trial. Now, in the course of the detention, there's systematic torture from the moment of arrest all the way to the interrogation, where perhaps it's the highest point of the violence and the torture, all the way until somebody is released or has died due to the torture. And the fourth one is the systematic denial of the civil and political rights, is ensuring that not at any point that the indigenous population can challenge this regime of oppression and domination. And what this means is that you don't allow for any public assembly, no protests, no demonstrations, no freedom of expression, no newspapers, no writing, no expression online in these days, and so on. So this is the regime. This is the regime that has been put in place by a settler colonial movement, the Zionist settler colonial movement from 1948 until today. This is what Amnesty International, I was working for the organization and I was co-author of the report that was published in 2022, but of course there were other organizations, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, Al-Haq, and others that have written about this. So this is kind of the context, the meta, if you want, the context in which this genocide is taking place. This apartheid regime maintains domination, but when it sees an opportunity to eliminate, it will eliminate. And this is what we're seeing today in Gaza, is an opportunity to eliminate the 2.3 million Palestinians that are living there, in killings, in the forcible displacement, and so on. And so part of the meta-understanding is also the numbers. So over 33,000 Palestinians, majority of whom are women and children, have been killed by Israeli bombardment, snipers, and so on. Over 1.5 million people have been displaced from their homes. There are now 70,000 people who are injured. There's deliberate mass starvation that is happening all across the Gaza Strip because Israel is preventing any form of humanitarian aid from coming into the Gaza Strip. So this comes also as part of this, if you want, meta-level understanding of the genocide and the context of the genocide and so on. But it's also very important to understand the genocide at a kind of a micro level. And what I mean by this is understanding it through the stories of individuals, of communities, of families, of towns, of cities, and so on. And the story can be the newborn babies who were left to die in Al-Shifa and other hospitals in Gaza when the Israeli army attacked these hospitals. These are stories of just a few days, 2, 3, 4 days, but they capture the entirety of the 76-year-old story in just a few days. But it could also be a longer story of a woman who's been forcibly displaced from her home in Jaffa in 1948, sought refuge in the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza, and then attack after attack has been forcibly displaced once and twice and 3 times and 4th time. So moved from Gaza to Khan Yunis, from Khan Yunis to Rafah, from Rafah to Egypt. And so you have that longer story. Both of them, the newborn and the grandma, if I may, kind of capture this. So it's very important to understand it at these two levels. And at the micro, I want to share about myself. And this is a way, kind of a segue into the second part of my talk. So I was born in Jerusalem in the early 80s, around the time when Israel laid siege on Beirut in its pursuit of the Palestinian Liberation Organization that was fighting from there. And Israel laid a siege on Beirut that is very similar to the siege that has been imposed on Gaza since 2007. And in 1982, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was pushed out of Beirut, forced to leave by ships into the sea. And right now, as we're speaking, the US, with the help of Israel and others, are constructing a port outside of Gaza City, which, in our view, is an attempt to push Palestinians again out to sea. Now, in 1982, Tunisia received the Palestinians, around 8,000, 10,000, I believe that were put on sea, on ships and sent to sea. This time, we don't think anybody would receive the Palestinians being pushed out of Gaza. I started school in 1987. That was the beginning of the first Intifada. And Intifada is the word we use for the uprising that was against Israel's settler colonial apartheid regime that was imposing a military occupation, and it took the forms of civil disobedience, strikes, boycotts, and so on. And I mention this is because I work, I'm part of the BDS movement, which builds on a very rich and long tradition of boycotts and civil disobedience. And one of the episodes of that, the kind of a rich episode of our history of this form of struggle was in the first Intifada. And boycotts were a very strong component of it. This is when Palestinians refused to buy from Israel, consume Israeli products, and so on. And here I always like to mention a film by a good friend of mine. His name is Amr Shomari. And the film is called Wanted 18. It's a documentary film that looks at his village in Beit Sahur, which played a leading role in the Intifada, particularly in the boycotts. And he looks at a cow's farm that when Palestinians in Beit Sahur decided not to consume Israeli milk, and that was the only milk that was cow's milk that you could find in the markets of the occupied West Bank, they bought, a group of activists came together and bought 18 cows. But then the Israeli military issued arrest warrants for the 18 cows and started a military pursuit of them. So the farm had to go underground. It was moving from one place to another because the army was after these cows. And so the film it interviews the activists about that time, so they talk about their experience. But it also uses animation to tell the story from the cow's perspective. And it's a wonderful film. It's an inspirational film, and I would advise everybody to watch it. But it tells the story of the Second Intifada. This is the time that I grew up with the consciousness, started understanding what was around me, what occupation means, Israel, the military, and so on. And then my teenagehood was the 90s. It's the time when we would be hearing about peace, statehood, prosperity, and so on, but at the same time, the system of segregation and control that I just described at the beginning was more and more being entrenched. Illegal Israeli settlements that are war crimes under international law have been more and more spread out. They've increased exponentially. And I grew up, I was born in Jerusalem, I grew up in Ramallah, and I remember when I would travel from my house to my grandmother's house in Jerusalem after school to do karate classes in Jerusalem. And I remember the road took about kind of 10-15 minutes maybe between the two, and there were no checkpoints. And I remember when the road was blocked by an Israeli military jeep. So the jeep would stop the cars and the taxis and the buses. It would be a few soldiers that are coming in and checking and preventing people from coming in or allowing them and so on. And then there was a block, a cement block that was added to that military jeep. And so you have a soldier on top of the block, another one beneath it checking the cars and the people passing, and there was another block and another block, and until it grew to a huge monster that it is right now, that separates Ramallah from Jerusalem, whereby this trip that I used to take is no longer possible at all. Since October, for example, this checkpoint has been completely closed off, not allowing any kind of movement between Ramallah and Jerusalem. So I grew. So what I say is I grew up with Qalandia. So if you've been to the West Bank, perhaps you remember, Martin, you were saying. If you've not checked it out, you can see the pictures of the Qalandia, of the monster that is Qalandia checkpoint. And then I graduated from school in 2001. That was when the second Intifada, the second uprising against Israel's apartheid rule, took place. It was perhaps a bit more militarized than the first one, but it was a popular struggle against Israel. But then went on to study outside and came back and started working with human rights organizations, first with Al-Quds University Human Rights Clinic, and I got married. And my wife is a refugee from Jaffa. Her family was forcibly displaced from there to Gaza. Her uncles are still right now in Jabalia in the north of Gaza, one of the areas that is, hard hit by the genocide and the mass starvation, so on. We've lost family members due to bombardment, but also sniper fire. And we live in a house in Ramallah where we can see the coast. We can actually see Jaffa, but she cannot go there. I can go there, but she cannot go there. And the reason for this is because we sit at different places in the hierarchy of legal statuses that Israel imposes on us. So on top of that hierarchy are Jewish Israelis. They are the nationals of the state. They enjoy all rights and privileges. The second class are those who are not Jewish, but do serve in the Israeli army. These are communities, Druze and Caucasian communities, that enjoy less than the Jewish Israelis in terms of rights and privileges, but more than all the others. The third comes somebody like me, who holds an Israeli citizenship. I'm not a national, but I'm a citizen of Israel. But I enjoy less rights than the Jewish Israelis in terms of, for example, self-determination, the ability to organize, in terms of kind of the collective rights, in terms of kind of like a national group that is not allowed at all. Now, the fourth are those who are not citizens of Israel, but have permanent residency. These are like my father. So he doesn't have citizenship, he's stateless, but he's granted this legal status of being able to live and move around and work in Israel. And civilian law applies to him, not military law. But now then you have the fifth category. This is where my wife sits. She holds a West Bank ID card. She is subject to Israeli military law rather than civilian law. So although both of us are, we're both Palestinians, we both live in the same house, but there are different sets of laws that are applicable to us. Now, Israel, of course, all this hierarchy is controlled through the population registry that is in the hands of Israel. So Israel puts, whoever comes in is born into the population registry. Anybody who dies comes out of it, and they have full control of it. And it has the different classifications here. So we classify it differently. And actually, according to law, because there are two laws that are applicable to us, I currently am illegal in my own home. So according to Israeli civilian law, as a citizen of the state, I cannot be in the area where my house is right now. But she cannot be in the area where I'm allowed to live. So she can be there if she's granted a permit from the Israeli military, but then a permit allows you certain hours to be there. Sometimes these hours are restricted. You won't be able to drive a car, you won't be able to work, and so on. So that's the fifth category. A sixth category are those who are basically Gazans. They would hold the same ID card, which is green. Mine is blue, by the way, and there's also color coding here. It would be a green ID card, but with a Gaza address, which means that you're only restricted to Gaza, which the UN described as the largest open-air prison in the world. That was a few years ago. And so if you're a Gazan, and there are many who live in the West Bank where I am, because of family, because of work, because they came to study and so on, you're not allowed to be there. You can only be in Gaza. And so if you're traveling on the road, for example, between your university and home, and you happen to stumble upon an Israeli checkpoint that was set up, and the soldier asks for the ID card, they look at it, they see you're from Gaza, they immediately put you in a jeep and can deport you back. And it doesn't matter if you have family, children, you've been there, you have your work, it doesn't matter. If you're a Gazan, you should be in that prison in that Bantustan, not in this one. So that's the Gazans in the hierarchy. Beneath them are those Palestinians and Arabs, who've managed in one way or another to make their way into the West Bank and married Palestinians, created families and so on, but Israel refuses to include them in the population registry, because the aim here is not to have more Palestinians, it's to have less Palestinians. So you don't want to add to the population registry, you want to always remove from the population registry. And so these people are not provided any legal status at all. And they live basically an underground life. They cannot travel between cities, they would be too scared to be passing Israeli checkpoints, issues with insurance and so on. And then underneath, of course, are the Palestinian refugees. Those 7 million. Palestinians, we're 14 million around the world. 7 million of us are in colonized Palestine, and the other 7 million are in forced exile outside. Those refugees are not allowed the right of return. Now, Israel does not consider that it has any kind of authority or rule over them, but in reality, it does, because it prevents them their right that is enshrined in international law from returning to their homes that they were forcibly displaced from in 1948 and 1967. So I say all of this just to kind of give, again, a bit of, a micro understanding, if you want, to this system, apartheid regime, in which, the larger context in which just genocide is happening. Now, soon after I married, I started working for human rights organizations, first with, as I said, Al-Quds University in a human rights clinic, but then with Human Rights Watch, and I moved then to work with Amnesty International. I spent around 11 years working for Amnesty International. And altogether, I spent 14 years working for human rights organizations. And reflecting back on these 14 years, it seems like there is a paradox that I want to kind of share with you here as a segue into then the third part of my talk. And the paradox is as following, is during these years, we've seen more and more exposure of Israel's systematic human rights violations and the creation of mechanisms by the UN to address these human rights violations. Yet, while there was more and more exposure and addressing, there was more and more entrenching of this system of apartheid and the systematic human rights violations. So when I first started working for human rights organizations, it was Israel has launched what at the time seemed like a qualitatively different type of colonial violence, an attack, a military attack against Gaza in 2008 and 2009. Now Gaza has been, by that time, a year, 2 years into a criminal siege that has been imposed on it, not allowing essential goods from coming into Gaza, not allowing anything to come out of Gaza, and of course, restricting the movement of people, basically keeping them in, well, the open-air prison that Gaza was and still is. After this military attack, there was something very significant, that the Human Rights Council has set up a commission of inquiry that was headed by a South African judge, Richard Goldstone, that documented and looked at, well, the violations that took place during that military attack, war crimes, crimes against humanity. They were very well documented. There were recommendations on how to address these violations for accountability and so on. And we saw that as something quite new. It gave us a little bit of hope that we have now this exposure by an authoritative body at the UN of what happened during 2008 and 2009. But 2 years later, Israel launches another attack, very similar attack against Gaza in 2012. And again, after that attack, there was also an investigation by the UN, a report and recommendations and so on, and we thought, okay, well, perhaps this added to that will create, a movement towards the end of impunity and so on. But that was not the case. In 2014, I was working for Amnesty, and I did a report. I investigated a pattern of killings of Palestinian, mostly young men, in the occupied West Bank. And after we finished the report, part of the report was looking at the village of Nabi Saleh, similar to my name. The village of Nabi Saleh is just outside the Ramallah, a very small village that in 2009, the illegal Israeli settlement of Halamish that is close by took over the water spring that belongs to the village, which the villagers also used for their agricultural land. And so the villagers started in 2009 weekly demonstrations where on Fridays after the midday prayers, they would gather around in the village center and start marching towards the spring to try to claim it back. And they would be met with massive violence that over the years has led to the killing of many in the community, the injury of many in the community, and of course the use of collective punishment, the firing of tear gas into homes where children are, the puncturing of water tanks that the people depend on, and so on. And so the Nabi Saleh and what happened was a kind of a significant part of the report. And when the report was published, we went to the village to present it to the activists who had worked with us and we had a relationship with. And when they had kind of organized the sitting, and it was a kind of a circle, and they were very welcoming, very positive, and one of the key activists there, his name is Bassem Tamimi. He's currently in Israeli prison as we speak. Bassem said, held the report, said, thank you very much, this is really great, very important. He opens at the recommendations page and says, you know, although this is very important and we thank you for it, what I see you doing here is telling Israel how to kill us better. And what Bassem was basically, what he meant in kind of explaining is that in the recommendations of the report, after all of this exposure of horrific crimes and human rights violations, Amnesty was recommending Israel how to reform its open fire regulations. So, you know, you need to expose more, you need to shoot like this, you need not to use a lot of ammunition here. If you're using tear gas, it needs to be in this way, not in that way. If you're using, you know, less lethal weapons, it has to be in these circumstances, not that circumstances, and so on. And although there were other recommendations that were quite significant, the report itself and what the Human Rights Organization produced and was producing, as others, did not really tackle the root causes of the issue. And this is what Bassem was saying. It did not address the entrenched system of oppression and domination, of apartheid, of why occupation is there, and why we have this situation of extreme violence that is inflicted upon us when we were protesting for something that is ours, you know, reclaiming the water spring, and against an illegal settlement, something that is considered a war crime under international law. And that was actually the beginning of, you know, the thinking around the apartheid report of Amnesty International, and, you know, started to think about how you can move from a place of addressing the symptoms of the reality in Palestine to addressing the root causes. But soon after the report was published, Israel launched what was at the time an unprecedented attack on Gaza, the 2014 war that was in July and August. It was the most extreme form that we've seen during this period. And the war was known for, among other things, the policy of wiping out families, entire families, while they were in their homes. I, as other workers at international organizations, human rights organizations that are based in the West Bank or other places, were not allowed to enter Gaza, not by the Israelis, neither by the Egyptians, to carry out documentation on the ground. So we had to rely on colleagues and co-workers in Gaza who were working under bombardment and other forms of threat and danger and so on. So it was really a horrific time, one of the darkest periods in my life, I would say. And after the report, we got something that we felt was, well, now perhaps will change the equation. Palestine, that was admitted as an observer state to the UN in 2012, was able to join treaties and conventions, and so joined the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And the International Criminal Court then started having jurisdiction over the occupied Palestinian territories and could investigate what had happened in 2014. Now, Palestine could have signed so that it allowed the court to look way back from 2002, but it did so only for 2014, but it captured the war. And I remember we were still collecting information and speaking to victims and witnesses in Gaza over the phone, and that was something that they started also asking about. It seemed like it was a glimpse of hope. You know, will this make a difference now? Will we see arrest warrants against Israeli war criminals? Are we going to see them in prison? Is my house going to be rebuilt? Am I going to be compensated, and so on? So, 4 years afterwards, 2018, and although there's a lot that happened in between, Palestinians in Gaza, majority of whom are refugees, organized the Great March of Return demonstrations. They march onto the barrier separating Gaza from the 1948 areas, demanding the right of return, which is enshrined in international law, and the lifting of the criminal siege that has in place now by that time for 11 years. But they were met with a massacre. Israel set up structures, earth mounds, and so on, where snipers were positioned and killed Palestinian demonstrators in the hundreds and injured them in their thousands. And most of the injuries were by sniper fire that were targeted Palestinians in the knees, basically leading to amputations. And I remember speaking to a colleague of mine when we were talking, and she saying something that was, you know, quite gruesome and disturbing. And she was saying, you know, thinking about, you know, this policy of shooting at the legs, at the knee, leading to amputations. She was saying that, look, when you kill a Palestinian, you take that Palestinian away from society. And this is very sad, of course, it's a loss and it's devastating. But when you injure, and most of the injuries were of young men who would be breadwinners of the families, when you injure somebody like this, you've paralyzed, and at this number, you've paralyzed the entire society. So now that person has, you know, to have the nurse and the doctor that are caring for him, the people at home who are caring for him, others who are now going to go and do the breadwinning of the family and so on, and these are in the thousands. And again, after 2018, another report, another action, another exposure, other condemnations, and so on, by the UN, by human rights organizations, and so on. In 2020, we get two significant developments. We have what was a preliminary investigation at the International Criminal Court become an official investigation, and the Human Rights Council also creating a mechanism for accountability that was new, which is a database of companies that are complicit in illegal Israeli settlements. So this is a qualitative also addition. Now, not only are we looking at Israel and Israeli violations, but we're also looking at companies that are complicit in these war crimes and violations. The year after, more killings. 2021 was the deadliest year for Palestinian children, according to Defense for Children International, for example, in the West Bank. 2002, also a very deadly year. Communities were forcibly displaced, ethnically cleansed, the expansion of the settlement, the entrenchment of the settler colonial apartheid regime, bringing us to now the worst episode of what we call the ongoing Nakba, the genocide that is happening in Gaza right now and as we speak. And, you know, I said at the beginning, it may seem as a paradox that you have exposure by the UN authoritative bodies, including the UN, at the same time it's an entrenchment. But it's not a paradox. What it is hypocrisy and double standards of the global West, of those that put the international law system in place following the Second World War, putting it into effect when it suits their interests, but really dropping it and acting hypocritically and in double standards when it does not. And it's not clear anywhere else, you know, more than Palestine. And why it's not a paradox is because of complicity. The complicity of states, of institutions, of corporations, of organizations in Israel's crimes, in Israel's apartheid regime. And this complicity exists here in Ireland. This then relates to Francesca Albanese's quote, is in Ireland, there's still diplomatic, military, academic, cultural relations with Israel. There's still trade with Israel. Ireland is one of Israel's biggest trade partners, I believe the seventh biggest trade partner. There's still products that are dual-use products. Products can be used for the military and civilians that are being exported from Ireland to Israel. There's military support, including perhaps, the government covers this, ammunition that is being transported from the US through Shannon Airport to Israel. So it is this complicity that is really allowing for, despite all of this exposure of apartheid, of genocide, and so on, that allows Israel to continuously entrench this system and its crimes against the Palestinians without being held to account, living in a black hole, basically, of impunity. And it's the states, institutions, and corporations that play a direct role in this. And this is why in 2002, then I left Amnesty International and joined the BDS movement. And what we do with the BDS movement is target this complicity. Is we call for the boycott of Israel, the divestment from Israel, and imposing on sanctions against Israel until the system of settler colonial apartheid is dismantled. Boycotts are what individuals can do. It's the campaigns that target Israeli goods and products that are coming into the countries. It's the academic and cultural boycott of complicit institutions, including, for example, universities that play a crucial role in this system of apartheid and genocide that is taking place right now. Divestment targets the companies that make profit out of these crimes that are being perpetrated by Israel against the Palestinians. And sanctions is what should happen when you have an apartheid regime. This is what happened in South Africa, and this is what we're calling to happen against Israel as well. And part of the work, just to mention about the apartheid-free zone, is the campaign that we're asking people all around the world, at the level of their communities, in their schools, in their universities, the cities, and ultimately, at the level of the state, to ensure that they are apartheid-free, that there is no direct or indirect relation to Israel. We're not buying from Israel, we're not selling Israel, we're not allowing Israel to be anywhere in our spaces. And this could happen by the boycott of, for example, Israeli products, but it could also happen by the passing of policies and legislation whereby you don't have any links to Israeli companies, institutions, and so on, but also not any companies that are complicit in Israeli crimes. What we are right now asking for is for the meaningful solidarity that I've seen all across Ireland. As I said, I've been traveling around the country, and really it's been heartwarming, it's been very inspiring, it's also been empowering. It's really important for Palestinians to see the support, to see people come out in the streets, to showing their supports. It gives us strength, it allows us to continue, but what we need is for this meaningful solidarity not to be seasonal, and to ensure that there is no repetition. I talked a lot about the 2014 war because I wanted to mention it now again. In 2014, we saw mass demonstrations all around the world. People went out in their millions, in Jakarta, in Dublin, in Washington. People went out in the hundreds of millions. Right? There were solidarity groups that sprung in different places. There were some BDS achievements also at that time. We thought at the time that there's not going to be a repetition. That now, seeing all of this, this mass support, this action, that we're not going to see a worse episode of colonialism. But yet here we are, actually, at a time when it is unprecedented. What we're seeing in terms of the colonial violence is both quantitatively and qualitatively different. And it's the first live stream genocide. We're seeing everything that is happening, how Israel is killing Palestinians in the tens of thousands, how it's starving the millions, and so on. And the reason for this is because the solidarity did not institutionalize itself so that it cuts complicity and not allow it to happen again. Israel will never be able to carry out, maintain its apartheid regime or carry out a genocide if it was not for the complicity that it enjoys from states, institutions, and corporations. Let me end by saying this. genocide, Gaza right now is a front for the whole of humanity. If Israel, supported by the US, UK, Germany, and other Western powers, succeeds in its genocide and gets away with it, we're entering a world where it's free for all. We're entering a world where might makes right, an age of chaos, as the UN Secretary General has called it, where if you dare to challenge Western domination, if you dare to challenge a state that has military power, you'll be wiped out. And there's nothing that is going to happen. No accountability, no condemnation, no nothing. This is a threat not only to smaller nations, but really to all of us, all around the world. It has global ramifications. And therefore, we must stop the genocide right now, but we must ensure also that the slogan of never again is meaningful and it's never again for everybody. Thank you.